Kathleen is here as our Cy Gittin Professor in our current pool of fellows. When she's not here, she's a professor in the School of Environment, Society and Sustainability at the University of Utah. She's also affiliated with the university's Middle East Studies program. Kathleen completed her BA in Geology and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania, her Master's in Geology at Bryn Mawr, and her PhD in geosciences at the University of Arizona. I'm not going to go through her publications because simply it'll take us for the rest of the evening. It is huge, vast, and impressive, but it draws on her field research in places like Egypt, East Africa, Turkey, Israel, Italy, and Sardinia, within Italy, I guess. She's also a geoscientist, a geoarchaeologist on the Kebet and the Ghazlan project in Jordan, which is the project that I run with Kathleen through the British Museum. If you want to read one of Kathleen's papers, find a 2021 paper from Geosciences, which is titled Eleanor Wright Gardner, Pioneer Geoarchaeologist, Quaternary Scientist, and Geomorphologist. For those in the room, hands up if you've heard of Eleanor Wright Gardner. And for those on Zoom, 1.5 hands just went up. By the end of this hour, I think the answers will be different. And for that, I welcome Kathleen. Kathleen, over to you.
But I'm happy to be here at the Albright with you all. The Albright Institute, as Jamie mentioned, is celebrating its centennial year. So there's really no better place to start with a few words from William Albright himself, who is the director for whom the Institute is named and a stranger to no one in the room. But worldwide, he said some pretty interesting things, including this, that women often make the best archaeologists, as is attested by a growing list of women archaeologists. However, and you know that word, however, it's a tough word, however. However, it is often wise to separate the sexes in excavating, since the presence of a mixed group in camp far from a team greatly increases the expense of maintenance. In small expeditions, it's difficult to mix the sexes unless the undertaking is very brief or is amply provided with funds. Where expeditions are mixed, it's highly desirable to have the director's wife present, both to provide a female social arbiter and to avert scandal, which has brought not a few expeditions to grief, ... Then there's the drama. And if I sweep through the words and look at some of the most important elements, I leave you with a few of them that strike me as a person who is not. However, to separate the sexes, it greatly increases the expense. It is difficult to mix the sexes unless simply or amply provided with funds. Having the director's wife present provides a social screen to avert scandal, which has brought expeditions to grief. He then goes on and says, Lady Petrie and Mrs. Garstang were invaluable members of their husbands' expeditions. Now, he said that in 1949. And today, I'm going to ask the questions, well, what about those people who weren't the director's wives? It turns out that many, many Mrs. unmarried ladies have been critically important in the archaeology of the Levant and the Near East. And today I want to mention some of them. Some of their names are sort of around in the newspaper world, and obscure mentions in the society pages, such as this one, weren't about women. Who's who in the workaday world, along with baby princess poses, posted in the most august year from the 20s, 28 in fact, saying that women archaeologists and jockeys, including Miss Winifred Lamb and Miss Gertrude Catton Thompson. And these were two ladies that were quite well off enough that their mentions made the society pages. They had gardens, they had wealth and means, but they were still misses. These misses, in fact, were pretty robust scientists in the field. As you may see here, Miss Winifred Lamb became the honorary curator of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge after getting her degrees and doing a lot of work. I'm sorry, her face is covered up there. That's pretty terrible. But on the right, Miss Gertrude Catton Thompson, her face is obscure because a lot of the photography done in this period wasn't adjusting for us to see people's faces. Truly, these figures are a bit hidden. And however, many misses are hidden or entirely missing from the historiography of archaeology. The historiography is basically the study of the way the discipline has evolved over time. And today in this talk, I'm going to focus more on the her part of the historiography, or the her stories, because for most of history, Anonymous was actually a woman, particularly in archaeology. I'm going to focus on this one particular figure you see on the right. It's time to illuminate some of the women explorers and scientists who have not been in public view. They remain obscured and hidden. This particular lady's name was Eleanor White Gardner, or Miss G as she was called, and some people called her by her initials, EWG, and she was an important scientist in the early 20th century. But few people know about her. This is because she's a hidden figure, and I'll just hit to the punchline. She worked in archaeological sites, but she was a geologist. So I'm going to talk today about how I believe she's an unsung figure, both as an explorer and as a geoscience heroine. She was a pioneer in her field, both in geoscience, also in archaeology, and in the study of the past 2 million years, the Quaternary period. She was a desert geomorphologist and, as I have found out, a patriot. I want to tell you more about these elements. From 1917 to about 1938 or 1939, this woman, Miss Eleanor White Gardner, did successfully a lot of things, including fieldwork in deserts all across South Africa, parts of the Sahara, the Mediterranean, and the Levant, as well as other places in the Near East. And commencing in 1925, she published significant contributions in multiple areas, including archaeology, the science of the past 2 million years, quaternary science, in geomorphology, which is the study in landscapes, as well as in paleontology and archaeology. And I now can tell you that it is my professed belief, as supported by my observations, that she is the first geologist to be a geoarchaeologist. And she did this well before geoarchaeology was something that was described in the 20th century. Now, you probably haven't heard about her too much. So I'm going to consider her sort of story, her career contributions as I see them in comparison to others. I am a desert person, a desert geomorphologist and geoarchaeologist. And what I want to tell you about is the most famous geologically oriented person who geomorphologists love. His name is Major Ralph Algernon Bagnall. And he worked in the early part of the 20th century in the Sahara and other places that we don't know too much about. But he did a lot of things, including he was commissioned by His Majesty's armed forces to lead expeditions out from the Nile into the desert in advance of World War II. And he had all of the resources of Great Britannia behind him to do so. He developed a sun compass that could be used for navigation. He documented archaeology where he went. He also developed certain modifications of his Ford motor pool so that it could go across sand and rocks. He also looked into the physics of wind-blown sand and developed a textbook that we still use today when we talk about dune sands. Actually, I'll just say that word instead of however. Actually, Miss G did everything that he did and before he did it, with the exception probably about the cars and being funded by George. She actually published well before Bagnall did. And by the way, bang, this is my big bang moment. She traversed by camel. She basically traversed solo across deserts with only her gun by her side. And she drove cars around by herself in the middle of nowhere to do her remote field work and to access places. She did everything that she was doing wearing skirt pants and being mainly by herself and underfunded. And this is why I have spent quite a lot of time thinking about how to dig up more dirt about her to tell you some stories about who she was. Because she was definitely the first of her kind, and we call these kinds of people in archaeology trowel blazers. So this is the modified title, digging up her stories, looking at trowel blazers in the early 20th century, with particular emphasis in this part of the world, in the Levant and in the Near East. Well, as I mentioned to you, you all know that geologists like rocks, but you may not know that geomorphologists, the branch of geologists who like the surface landforms, the beautiful canyons, the sort of way the earth looks, we like dirt. In this talk, I'll be presenting some findings that are a different kind of work that I normally do. This has been a passion project for me for many years, as I'll explain. And so I've been doing a different kind of digging into the past to give you this talk today. As archaeologists, most of you know that looking at dirt, you're able to kind of interpret it and the trash inside the dirt to tell stories about the ancient past. I'm doing a different kind of digging entirely in this particular line of work, trying to describe a trailblazer in the past. Let me tell you some of the methods that I've used to uncover the stories of Eleanor White Gardner. Well, I've spent essentially most of my career looking into her, to be honest. I started thinking about Eleanor actually when I was an undergraduate student. And so I mention this in case you're an undergraduate student wondering what you're going to do with your life. Well, I did find something that I've been doing my whole life since I was an undergraduate. And okay, maybe I haven't been paid too much. But I've been working on this because I did something called an honors thesis when I was a student. And I was working on some satellite images of a place in Egypt. And I was doing the literature search. And I found out that Eleanor White Gardner studied the areas that I was looking at in my satellite images. Except I had images from NASA, and she didn't. And I read all of her papers and I thought, wow, this is a lady going out in the 20s and 30s. What am I doing here at NASA doing this sort of internship looking at satellite data? So it turned out that I ended up studying her publications, of which there are many, mentioned to you. And then so one of the things that ended up happening was that during the pandemic, which you probably know since you're here and you've lived through it, several of us were bored at home, and we did things like search public records and look at information online. So one of the things that I was doing occasionally when I was bored was looking, Googling a lot of things besides recipes. And I ended up going into the National Archives of the US and I Googled for Eleanor White Gardner, in part because I'd spent up until 2020 not really understanding anything besides the fact that she was born in the UK. She was born in Britain in 130 some years ago. When I did do that, I found finally her mother's passport. And from that point, I was able to utilize resources that we have available to us in the great state of Utah called ancestry.com. And that actually was really helpful because up until that point, I thought that Eleanor, who is well known to be British, was British born of British family members. And a little back and forth of it, I realized by getting this sort of Google thing going on, that Google could be my friend and confirm a lot of things. So after I found her mother's passport, I am not able now to advance. Oh, there we go. Okay. I was able to find out as things were getting put online, because many people were doing things at home and scanning, and it was actually a revolution of digitization in the world. I found some files related to Eleanor and her comings and goings and moving around. So I went through a lot of ship manifests, and I was able to figure out when she was moving from point to point. And I found out that her corpus of work and the number of things and the number of places that she'd been in her life were much more than I even could know. So I, for example, was able to trace her movements by knowing where she got on board ships and where she was going, so that I could trace out when she was specifically at different digs where I had some idea that she came and went to. Over time, I realized that most of the materials related to her life were destroyed in the Blitz when the Germans were bombing London, because her field notebooks from every excavation were stored at the places that funded her. And this was before photocopiers. So a lot of her data sets, as well as her primary documentations related to permitting agencies, were gone. So because many of the archives that do exist for Eleanor that I know about today were actually sent to Canada during World War II, those came back right prior to the pandemic and were digitized during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, we found her notebooks at the Royal Geographical Society, who had funded a lot of her work. So this was an actual brand new thing for many years, searching for Eleanor. I couldn't find her parents, I couldn't find her work, I couldn't figure out a timeline of her. Over the years, I've been able to read the 3 or 4 notebooks that we have available for her to reconstruct her whole life. In these notebooks, we don't have a lot of personal information, but I have very meticulous details about how many camels she took, how much food was costing, etc. And to get the kind of color commentary on her personality, I've had to trust the memoirs of the people she associated with, the very wealthy people that she worked with, and women of society, including this lady, Miss Eleanor, friend for life, which is Gertrude Catton Thompson. You may have heard of this person. She's a very famous archaeologist, and she basically said in her diaries that she kept that I've never failed to feel so much that I may have accomplished everything that was due to Eleanor's help and to her partnership. In fact, some of the only photographs that we have of Eleanor include 3 photographs that Gertrude took of her in the field, including this one, which you can't see Eleanor's face, but she wrote, Gertrude wrote a note on the photograph saying, Eleanor Gardner with her ranging pole taking an unaccustomed rest. A lot of the material that Gertrude describes about Eleanor is how hard she worked, how faithful she was, how kind she was, and how meticulous she was, and how much she liked to study the landscape. Some of my recently discovered notes outline some new findings. Here's one interesting one. This is a list of her slides that she presented at a talk. I don't know the date of the talk, but she was talking about her work in a place of Egypt called Fayum, where she worked from 1925 to 1928. And she basically was presenting this. These were her notes. And I noticed up at the top something very interesting, which I'll zoom into. Come and tell me how you work, underlined Agatha Christie live or live. Actually, this is indicating to me that she did know Agatha Christie, and because Agatha Christie's memoirs that were published in 1946 were entitled Come Tell Me How You Live. And I believe that she and Agatha were actually in conversation, and Agatha, who was getting more and more involved in archaeology as she married Max Mallowan, whom she met in Persia at the time, she was talking to the people in the community and of which Eleanor was today. I'll tell you more about this community because Eleanor, it seemed, worked everywhere that was hot in archaeology back in the day. This was the golden era of archaeology in the 20s and 30s. And the list of people that she knew was pretty amazing. Here are some of them. Gertrude Catton Thompson, Ms. Dorothea Bate, Miss Dorothea Garrett, Miss Winifred Lamb, and Kathleen Kenyon. Other people she knew were actually attached and married, including Agatha Christie Malin, Freya Stark, Mary Nicole Leakey, and Sir Flinders Petrie, James Breasted, James Starkey, and some other mysterious people, including a Hungarian count that I won't talk about today because I don't have enough time. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you Miss G and the timelines I've been able to reconstruct, sort of like Law and Order, except about archaeology. As I said, we know very little about her youth. This is the copy of her mom's passport that was scanned in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And you can see that on the form, Eleanor's mother explains that she's renewing her passport, which was not an emergency passport, by the way, but Eleanor's mom was basically explained to the US government that her husband Guy came to Great Britain to form a company to manufacture steel and iron chains. This would have been in the 1800s. And we had intended returning to the United States of America, sick, that's what she wrote, when he got his company running successfully. He died in 1901. My daughter received a scholarship for Newnham College, Cambridge University, and I have remained in order to complete my daughter's education. So this was the first I was able then to reconstruct the family tree. Emily Montgomery married Guy Higgins Gardner, and they had 3 children, one of whom was a captain in conscripted in the British Army and was served in the Anglo-Boer War. Her sister Emily Montgomery Gardner, and Eleanor was the only one born in the UK. Basically, the others naturalized over time as they remained anchored in the UK. So now I've been able to take her timeline and to populate it with her accomplishments. So I want to give you a few highlights of those. In 1912, she went up to Newnham in Cambridge, and she started to study natural sciences. At the time, that was geology, botany, and other chemistry and other things about nature. This was one of the only colleges in the UK system that took women for natural sciences. And in that program, Eleanor met a famous lady called Gertrude Els, who was a paleontologist, studied dead organisms in the fossil record. And this was the first lady to actually be awarded a leadership and a readership position at Cambridge. In 1919, she was also elected to the Geological Society of London Fellowship. Now, this partnership between Gertie Els over time with Eleanor became very instrumental in Eleanor's career. Gertrude nominated Eleanor to join a very elite club called the Sedgwick Club at Cambridge, which was essentially an outdoors-oriented club. This basically enabled students to mix the sexes, which, as you know, is expensive and can cause grief and drama. This was especially, great for women wanting to essentially hill walk and botanize, as they say. And Els basically helped normalize a community in which unconnected, unmarried people could be proper, shall we say, and do activities together. From the period that Eleanor was at Newnham, she interacted with a lot of friends and made lifelong partnerships with women who were interested in archaeology, history, classics, botany, all kinds of things. As you can see some of the names that she met from this association with Newnham College up at Cambridge. And while she was at Cambridge, she was there with her sister, who we have a great picture of because she was awarded the King's Medal for her work in architectural preservation. This was a very gifted lady who was a teacher, a wartime cross veteran for World War I, and she also was a photographer who was specialized in taking photographs for the king of landforms and landscapes, as well as architectural elements. And her favorite one were windmills. And so basically she won an award for that. I believe she also taught Eleanor how to take great pictures. Eleanor and her sister Emily were very active in the women's suffragist movement while they were at Cambridge. And Emily actually took several of the very important portraits that are known of the women suffragists from Britain, including the Pankhurst family. Now, in 1915, Eleanor got a high mark. She, however, couldn't be given a degree because Cambridge didn't do that until 1948, very late in the game. But later on, she decided to leave the country for a while, and she essentially landed a position as the acting professor and head of department at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. So she set sail and got there and lived there for a while. She lived there in proximity to her brother, who had worked in the war and settled down there for a while. When she came back after that and came back to England, she started working with Gertrude Catton Thompson, and she started studying land surveying. And then she essentially did master's level work and couldn't get her degree because Cambridge didn't award degrees until 1948. You can see from this timeline, she started to work in the Fayoum at this point with Gertrude, putting her experience from book learning related to surveying and plane tabling, which is this funny thing here on the right, to good use. Now, in the Fayoum in 1925, Gertrude was working on looking for settlements. And Eleanor was doing land surveying because she thought that anytime the Nile rose to a high flood level, the water chucked over the sides and dumped water into this depression called the Fayoum Depression. So she decided that she had to survey the whole area to see if that was possible technically. And so she went around by herself along with a Bedouin person she hired, and she made the first contour maps of this area that were published in 1925. You can see this is quite a large area for a lady to haul equipment around wearing culottes and speaking some Arabic. During this time, Eleanor was convinced that water availability defines times when the Sahara is more viable for certain people to live. And the importance of springs and water around is key for prehistoric people. It turns out that Eleanor and Gertrude lost their concession due to some unsalubrious things that happened that I don't have time to go into. Join me in part 2 when this happens. They lost their concession to a man named James H. Breasted, Henry Breasted. And I'm not sure I know all of the details quite yet, but you may know him because he's quite famous for founding the Oriental Institute and being elected to the National Academy of Sciences. In 1926, Eleanor was working in Greece and in other places in Anatolia with her friend Winifred Lamb from Newnham, and she started filming things with motion pictures. There are many of these motion pictures at the British Film Institute, and I believe they're among the first ones of the period on record. Then at that point, in that year, she was appointed as a lecturer in geology at a new women's college called Bedford, which eventually became the University College of London system, associated with Royal Holloway in the end. Long story there. But Eleanor progressed and kept working, and she published things about the Fayoum and was elected to the Geological Society of London Fellowship because she was nominated by Gertie Ells, her professor at Newnham. And then she was elected to the Royal Geographical Society, who gave her and Gertrude Catton Thompson money to go back to the Fayoum over the years. They got a new concession that was different than the one that was taken from them. In 1930, Eleanor didn't have a lot of money, but she ended up winning a long-term appointment at Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, which ended up being really, really super important for her because it gave her an anchor point and financial stability for a while, and it enabled her to work along with Eleanor in this place called Karga Oasis. And they got some money from the Royal Anthropological Institute to do this work. And some of the things that Eleanor wrote about this in her notes was that she was very excited to be doing geological work in Karga. And then you can see here just the words of her colleague, Gertrude, saying, "My valued colleague," and in collaboration with mine, it's going to be a great, rich thing that we do together. These ladies decided that instead of taking the railway over 175 kilometers, that they would hire some camels and walk 175 kilometers across terrain with their gear, water, and equipment, so that they could see the landscape and see whether there were artifacts there. So you can see from here, they started leaving the area near Abydos on December 9th in 1930. And they had 3 workmen and a bunch of camel herders, and they carried sufficient water. Over time, they were looking and they walked along the railroad grade, and they walked across terrain, and they found a lot of artifacts, including Badarian style artifacts, which is a feat in itself, because this is what the terrain looks like when I went there. Can you imagine trying to find very small lithic tools in very broken up terrain? It's a nightmare. In 1931, they actually decided to ask for aerial support to do some mapping, and they couldn't get it from the official channels through the government, so they asked their gal pal, Lady Mary Bailey, who was a famous aviatrix, and she flew down from London to Cairo to take some photographs with them. So she flew out, and basically they spent a week collecting overflight information and lots of aerial photographs. This is just a picture of Lady Bailey with her Pusma. And in the paper that was published the same year as the flight, they were able to turn their observations around very quickly. Gertrude Catton-Thompson said that collecting flights and photos eliminated hours and hours of dreary work in the field for them in difficult terrain. And it enabled them to do an oasis-wide survey in an area that's very hard to map. So here is a picture taken by Lady Bailey, who had a special photographic setup inside of her plane. And you can see that they published their work in 1931 saying, "We are the first expedition in Egypt to have the use for a whole fortnight of an entire airplane placed without restriction for scientific service in the field work." At this period, Eleanor was very interested in oases and water, and they started being very interested in irrigation. So Eleanor started mapping things, and she started mapping springs. She published this springs work that she studied in 1932, and she made this map over here on the right from plane tabling, and she mapped in the spring deposits, which you can clearly see from Google Earth today. And she did it by herself using the aerial photography and on the ground. In 1932, she published the first maps from this part of the world. Here they are at the Royal Geographical Society, and they're quite beautiful and pretty good detail for the amount of footprint terrain they covered. Inside some of the springs, Eleanor dug holes into the spring mounds because the springs were precipitating water and all kinds of calcium carbonate, and they were encrusting all these tools. Eleanor found these Acheulean Paleolithic tools encased by this matrix of calcium carbonate. And she's the first person to say that the Sahara always wasn't as arid as it is today, even though it was back in 1930. So the book that Catton-Thompson published in 1952, even though it has been authored by Catton-Thompson, has a lot of the figures and maps and work of her colleague, Eleanor White Gardner. You can see here that in my work for my master's degree, we went back and surveyed it, and we were able to find these spring mounds here near the geologic hammer, encrusting these kinds of Acheulean hand axes in the area. We also were interested in retracing Eleanor and Gertrude's steps across the desert. You can see this is a picture we have that Gertrude Catton Thompson took of Eleanor around her tent. And you can see that she's taking notes, and you can see, because it's a tent flap, that it would blow around a lot in the wind. And so the edges of the tent are anchored down with large stones, usually one of which is in front of her tent right here. When you pick up and mobilize from a tent site like this, you leave what are called the tent stones behind. So we were able to find those actual spots where they camped after about 6 years of looking as a collective party group. And we actually saw right where this person is crouched, Eleanor's samples, discard piles of the Paleolithic implements that weren't pretty enough to send to the British Museum or the Royal Ontario Museum, etc. But they're all labeled with her writing and just cast off. So moving on, Eleanor worked a lot of places. I'm just going to give you a couple of them really fast. She worked in Anatolia with Winifred Lamb and did sondages in the early Bronze Age. She worked in the Levant, including places with the Petrie team and Petrie's pups. She worked in Bethlehem at the bone beds. She worked up in the north in Carmel with Dorothy Garrett. We know that she worked in 1930 in Wadi Gaza, and that it took until 1952 for that work to be published. We know that it was a dangerous thing, but she wanted to do her work by herself alone, because Olga Tuftsnell's diary says, "We expect Miss Gardner back from her trip in the Wadi tomorrow, God willing." Yes, inshallah. In 1932, she was working with Dorothy Garrett after Dorothy Garrett's team found some very impressive finds, including Yusra, and I'll mispronounce this, I'm so sorry, Al-Karmalaya, found a Palestinian lady who found the Neanderthal Tobun 1 skulls up there. As you may know, there's no trace of this lady following the Nakba. Dorothy and Eleanor became partners in looking at some of the deposits in the Hula Valley associated with the famous Acheulean sites up there, and basically worked hand in hand to describe the landscape and the remains. And over time, she started working with a lady named Dorothea Bate near Bethlehem in bone beds, where they discovered extinct elephantoids and rhinos that were not known in this part of Africa or the Near East at all. Turns out Starkey, a man you may be familiar with if you're in the room today, this man was an archaeologist working with Petrie. Starkey decided to take that concession from them. And this is an area of gray that I'm in the process of researching now because I don't have all the details. But what we do know is that over time, Starkey had the concession for the Bethlehem beds, but guess who did the science? It was the ladies. The ladies did the science, and they published 2 papers in Nature in the, 1937 in this case, the one led by Eleanor. So this is clear that Starkey was in nominis, the concession holder, but that the work and the digging mostly was done by Eleanor. In 1937, Eleanor and Gertrude Catton Thompson went into the part of Yemen called the Hadramaut. It's in the south part of the peninsula. They were well funded, and they were supposed to join an ethnographer named Freya Stark. They went here in the southern coast to map and look at irrigation, and it was kind of a big publicity stunt. But basically, it was a big disaster because all of them got really sick. They had some issues with Freya Stark and Gertrude. They did not get along. There was a lot going on, but to some, in the end, science was done, and also fiction was done. So it turns out that villainous female archaeologist in her 1940 book, Winter in Arabia by Freya Stark, is basically Gertrude Catton Thompson. And her angst was taken out in describing horrible things that Gertrude, the other lady's name, did. The science that was done in the Hadramaut was some of the first science that happened in this part of the world. that made it out into the public discourse. And they discovered a moon temple and some very interesting writings and things. This part of the story is still under development by yours truly, me. But in this period, when they were out in the Yemen working in the Hadramaut, Eleanor got a telegram that basically said that James Starkey had been murdered. And basically, she was very upset and worried because at this point in time, Starkey had held the Bethlehem permits, and they were supposed to continue excavating there and preparing that work. So she sent off a response saying, I don't want to work in Bethlehem unless it's under Dorothea Bate, my colleague Dorothea Bate. But Dorothea Bate worked for the Natural History Museum in London, and home base in London said, Dorothea's not going to go back to Bethlehem to work on this because things and tensions were mounting at this point in time. At this point in time, Palestine was undergoing a lot of geopolitical complexity, and the story from this point forward is what I'm piecing together now. It seems that during the 30s, the prior period between the wars was very, very exciting for archaeology, but it got more and more geopolitically tense and less is known. And my ongoing research is trying to understand the kind of closing of what happened in the late 30s. And in particular, prior to Eleanor resigning all of her fellowships and leaving the field entirely in 1939. What happened? I'm not sure, but I have some clues. One of which is that a picture that I found in 1941, Eleanor here, and this is the 5th picture I have of her, and this one quite shows her face fairly well. In this picture, she's wearing a Land Army uniform. The only reason I know that is because I spent some time hanging out in the Imperial War Museum. And I realized that this was maybe why she was there was because I know she went to horticultural school after she left the Levant. Well, it turns out in 1940, Churchill called for the Women's Land Army to reform. It had been something that was a strategic advantage in World War I, and he said every endeavor must be made to dig for victory, to produce the greatest volume of food of which this fertile land is capable. And so women were encouraged to join the Women's Land Army. And it turns out that Eleanor White Gardner managed the land girls at Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, where she was still a fellow. She helped convert the lawns and the grounds there into fertile terrain that could grow food to support people. In 1941, college records indicate that Eleanor led efforts to grow over 8 tons of food on the college grounds. So here's just a picture of the land girls that are not from Lady Margaret Hall, which is a very fine institution. So a couple of conclusions before I close. I think it's important to keep working on telling stories about women that center women and what women are doing, as opposed to how they might be attached to other things. The intellectual alliances with other women are really strong and interesting, and Eleanor is like a hub of influence among so many projects that I think all deserve attention and celebration. One theme in her life is that women can be successful despite serious adverse professional conditions, and they had a tight cohort that helped each other to survive. So in the pantheon of women scientists, moving from the grandmothers of the field of archaeology and ethnography to the others who came after them, we have a wide array of women who all knew each other. And they had their colleges who taught women and cared about women to think. And they had each other to support each other. So thank you so much for your support, as we had a little bit of kerfuffle here with broadcasting in the world. And before I close with this slide, saying thank you to the grandmothers and the other people who follow to get me to where I am, I want to say thanks to the people who funded my life's approaches. Obviously, it's impossible to get money doing a biography of a lady that was kind of dead lived 132 years ago. But I got a lot of money when I was a graduate student from NASA, which got me started in looking at places that Eleanor walked that I could look at from space before I could get there. And then over time, when I was at Oxford, I got some money from the Royal Society. And recently I've gotten money from INCMA and the Royal Geographical Society. So thank you very much for listening to my story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have questions, and I hope you look forward to my next chapters as I keep digging more up. Thank you.